The air still smelled like smoke. My shoes crunched on shattered glass and charred wood. What used to be my living room was now just blackened rubble. My house, everything I owned, was gone, burned to the ground. And standing behind the police tape with a smug look on her face was none other than Karen, the HOA president. She didn't even try to hide her satisfaction. She folded her arms, tilted her head slightly, and gave me a look that said, "You brought this on yourself." It's hard to describe the feeling of losing everything. You don't think about the little things until they're gone. Family photos, the coffee mug from your first job, the guitar you never played but couldn't throw away, just piles of ash now. The firefighters had done their best, but by the time they arrived, the flames had already won. They told me it was suspicious. That's the word they used. Suspicious. But I didn't need an investigation to know who was behind it. Karen had made it clear for months that she hated me. Not for anything serious. I didn't throw wild parties or block driveways. I just didn't bend to her ridiculous HOA rules. And for someone like her, that was enough. You see, Karen was the kind of person who thrived on control. She didn't care about the neighborhood looking clean or orderly. She cared about power. And when I moved in and didn't jump to repaint my fence the exact shade of beige she liked, that was war. At least in her eyes. It started small. Petty fines. Notes on my door. Emails filled with made-up violations. I brushed it off at first, thinking it would blow over. But she was relentless. She once reported me for having excessively long grass, when I had just mowed it the day before. Then came the threats. Veiled at first, then more direct. People who don't follow HOA rules usually end up regretting it, she once said with a tight smile during a board meeting. Still, I didn't think it would come to this. I stood outside the wreckage as the sun rose. Neighbors gathered. Some whispered. Some offered help. But Karen? She just stood there, arms crossed, satisfied. Like she had finally erased the one thing in the neighborhood that didn't fit into her perfect little picture. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this wasn't over. Not even close. She thought she had silenced me. She thought by burning my house to the ground, she'd finally made her point. But she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because next week, I wasn't going to be standing on the other side of the police tape. I was going to be sitting in the courtroom, at the front. She didn't know it yet, but Karen had just committed arson against someone who knew exactly how to make her pay for it. Legally. Publicly. Permanently. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That night, just hours after the fire, I sat in my car, watching the firefighters finish up. The street was lit by flashing red lights, and the charred frame of my home still smoked in the cold air. My phone buzzed. It was my assistant. I told her to start pulling every HOA complaint from the past year. Every email. Every voicemail. I wasn't just going to accuse Karen. I was going to build a case that left no room for escape. The fire had taken my home. But it had also lit something else, resolve. And while Karen was still gloating, still convinced she'd won, I was already preparing something she couldn't burn down. She thought she was the queen of this neighborhood. The final word. The authority. But she didn't know who I really was. She didn't know what I did for a living. Or how many judges I knew on a first-name basis. She thought she was untouchable. That no one would stand up to her. That everyone would stay quiet, afraid of HOA fines or community gossip. But not me. Karen had no idea that her power was built on nothing. And soon, she'd be forced to walk into a courtroom where the rules weren't hers to make. Where every lie she told would be ripped apart. Where every smug look would be wiped clean. Where I would be waiting. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I honestly thought I had found peace. It was quiet, clean, and seemed like the kind of place where people minded their own business. The lake down the road was calm in the mornings, birds chirped like a soundtrack, and my backyard had the perfect view of the sunset. After years of city chaos and apartment walls that felt like paper, this was supposed to be a fresh start. But I underestimated the power of a bored, bitter woman with too much authority and too little to do. Karen introduced herself on the very first day I moved in. She didn't bring cookies or a smile. Just a printed copy of the HOA rules, highlighted. She handed it to me like a summons. "We run a tight ship here," she said, narrowing her eyes at the moving truck. "I'd hate to see you start off on the wrong foot." I should have known right then. She gave me a tour of what she called the problem spots of the community. An overgrown bush 2 houses down. A faded paint job on a garage. Someone had planted sunflowers. And Karen was still furious they hadn't asked for permission first. "They think it's charming," she muttered. But this isn't a farm. At first, I thought maybe she was just trying too hard to keep things orderly. Maybe she'd been burned by bad neighbors in the past. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. I thanked her, told her I'd go over the rules, and kept it moving. That was my mistake. By the end of the first week, I had already received my first HOA email. A violation for having my trash bins visible from the street, even though it was trash day. The next day, another email. My grass was half an inch taller than regulation height. Then came the warning for unapproved outdoor furniture, which was just a wooden bench my niece made in shop class. I tried to keep my cool. I tried to play by the rules. But it didn't matter. Karen had decided I was the problem, and that meant she wasn't going to stop. And it wasn't just me. I started hearing the same stories from other neighbors, in whispers over mailboxes and quick grocery chats. One woman had been fined 3 times for a garden gnome. A veteran across the street had his American flag reported as a potential distraction. A single mom got penalized for having her car parked in her own driveway overnight. Karen ruled this place like a petty dictator. And the HOA board? All hand-picked friends of hers. They nodded when she spoke. Signed whatever she put in front of them. Nobody questioned her. And those who tried, their lives got harder fast. Still, I tried to be diplomatic. I attended the meetings. I raised concerns. I asked for clarity on the rules. But Karen's smile never reached her eyes. She treated every question like an attack and every neighbor like a subject. She didn't want peace, she wanted submission. I remember one meeting in particular. I calmly explained that her violation notices were excessive and seemed targeted. I had printed out side-by-side photos of my yard and 2 others on the same street, both clearly out of compliance by her standards. But only I had received warnings. Karen leaned forward, looked me in the eye, and said, "Maybe they're just better at following rules than you." That's when I knew this wasn't about rules. It was about control. The warnings kept coming. The pressure built. And slowly, I noticed strange things happening. My mailbox was dented. A nail was found in one of my tires. Someone scraped my rear bumper and drove off. When I asked around, people shrugged. But their faces said more than their words. Everyone was afraid of Karen. Some had lived under her rule for years. Others tried to leave, but the HOA made it difficult. Petty fines would suddenly appear during a home sale. Real estate agents were warned about uncooperative owners. One man even said he backed out of a sale because Karen told the buyer my home had ongoing disputes. She was sabotaging me. It wasn't just inconvenient anymore. It was calculated. And the more I pushed back, the harder she pushed forward. I started documenting everything. Every email. Every letter. Every mysterious occurrence. I knew something bad was coming. I just didn't know how far she'd go. Until the fire. That was the moment she crossed a line. But it wasn't the first time she tried to destroy what I had built. It was just the most visible. The final move in a long, quiet war she'd been waging since day one. But what she didn't understand is that not everyone bows. Some people push back harder. And I was just getting started. The day the fire happened started out like any other. Calm. Normal. I made coffee. Took a short walk. Checked my emails. If you had told me that by nightfall, I'd be watching my house crumble into a pile of glowing embers, I wouldn't have believed you. But by then, nothing about this neighborhood shocked me anymore. Especially not when Karen was involved. I had left for dinner with a friend around 6 that evening. I remember locking the front door, setting the alarm, and glancing back at the porch light as I walked to my car. Everything was perfectly in place. There were no signs of anything unusual. No strange cars, no broken windows, no smell of gas in the air. Just the familiar stillness of suburbia. The dinner lasted about 2 hours. I wasn't even finished with dessert when I got the call. It was from a neighbor, one of the few who still had the guts to talk to me. Her voice was shaking. "Your house, it's on fire. The flames are everywhere." I already called 911. At first, I thought she had to be mistaken. Maybe it was a small kitchen fire. Maybe someone else's home, and she just panicked. But then I heard the sirens in the background. Loud, overlapping, and getting closer. That's when my heart dropped. I sped home like a maniac. Every second felt like a mile. As I turned the final corner into my street, the sky was lit orange. Thick smoke curled up into the dark. My chest tightened. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My home, the one I built, repaired, and protected, was engulfed in fire. Flames danced through the windows. The roof was already caving in. I slammed the brakes and jumped out before the car even fully stopped. Firefighters were everywhere, shouting, spraying, coordinating. Neighbors stood in clusters, some recording on their phones, others just watching silently. And among them, standing with her arms crossed like she had just watched a show she personally directed, was Karen. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look concerned. She looked satisfied. I locked eyes with her. She didn't blink. Didn't even flinch. Just stared at me like she had finally gotten what she wanted. That moment stayed frozen in my mind, even as the rest of the night blurred into chaos. The fire chief pulled me aside. "We're containing it, but it's too far gone," he said, voice firm but respectful. I asked if they knew the cause. He said it was too early to say, but it didn't look natural. When someone like that uses those words, you know something's wrong. Hours later, when the flames had been mostly tamed and the blackened remains of my house stood smoldering in the moonlight, the fire investigator arrived. He took photos, walked around the perimeter, and asked me a series of calm, detailed questions. Had I left any appliances on? Had I smelled gas before? Any enemies? I didn't hesitate. I gave him Karen's name. He didn't react immediately, but he did make a note. I told him everything. The harassment, the threats, the obsession with control. I even showed him the emails, some of which contained subtle but undeniable language. "You're going to regret this. You won't last long here. We know how to deal with difficult homeowners." He nodded as he listened, said they'd check security footage in the area. I didn't want to get my hopes up, but I also knew one thing: Karen made mistakes. She thought she was smarter than everyone. She thought no one would fight back. That arrogance makes people sloppy. Later that night, a neighbor texted me anonymously. Said their camera caught someone walking around my house shortly before the flames started. Hooded. Quick. Moving like they knew what they were doing. They didn't say it outright, but we both knew who it looked like. I forwarded the clip to the investigator. And that's when something shifted. What had felt like a personal tragedy now turned into a criminal investigation. What Karen had probably hoped would be dismissed as a freak accident was quickly becoming a serious case. I could see it in the way the officers moved. More questions. More evidence being collected. Word was spreading. But Karen didn't disappear. No. She was bold enough to attend the emergency HOA meeting the next morning like nothing had happened. She even suggested replacing the HOA sign near the entrance because it had smoke damage. That was Karen. Cold. Calculated. Cruel. But she had no idea what was coming. Because unlike the others, I wasn't going to take it quietly. She thought I was just another homeowner she could bully into submission. She had no idea she'd just set fire to the wrong life. 2 days after the fire, I sat on a folding chair outside what used to be my front steps. Everything around me was ash and ruin. Pieces of charred wood stuck up like broken teeth. The brick chimney was still standing, blackened and alone. You don't realize how quiet destruction is until it's over. The silence was heavier than the smoke ever was. But I wasn't sitting in shock. I wasn't sitting in grief. I was waiting. Detectives had been by earlier that morning. The investigation was officially opened as a case of arson. The fire marshal had confirmed it. Accelerants were found. The fire had started at 2 points, one near the side entrance, another in the back. That meant it was intentional. That meant someone had planned it. And I already had my main suspect, Karen. While the investigators were doing their job, I was doing mine. I wasn't just a homeowner. I wasn't just another HOA victim. I had spent most of my career in courtrooms. I knew how to build a case. I knew how to find cracks in people's lies. And now I had a personal reason to do it better than ever. I pulled up my files, everything I had kept on Karen over the last year. It wasn't just emails or petty fines. I had timelines. I had recordings from HOA meetings. I had statements from neighbors who had been targeted too, but were too scared to speak up. I had enough to make her nervous. But I needed more. So I started knocking on doors. Not everyone opened. Some peeked through blinds and didn't say a word. But others were ready to talk. One neighbor said she saw Karen driving slowly past my house about 30 minutes before the fire started. Another remembered hearing a car door slam right after midnight, just minutes before flames lit up the sky. A few admitted they'd received vague warnings from Karen in the past. "Be careful who you support," she'd told one couple after they complimented my garden. "Some people don't belong here." It was all starting to come together. And then came the real break. A tech-savvy friend of mine, someone I once helped win a tough zoning dispute, offered to recover footage from a corrupted camera across the street. The fire had knocked out the Wi-Fi signal, but the footage was still on the device. After a few hours of work, he sent me a clip. The quality wasn't perfect, but it was enough. At 11:52 p.m., a figure appeared near the back corner of my house, dressed in black. Hood up. The person carried a small container, Gascon size, and disappeared out of view for about 45 seconds. Then a flash. Then another. Then the figure sprinted away. The height, the build, the way they moved, it all lined up with Karen. But even more damning, the security lights turned on for just a moment, and the figure turned their head slightly. I paused the frame. Karen's shoes. Those ridiculous white sneakers with the red heel tab. The same pair she wore to every HOA meeting like they were her badge of authority. I backed up the video and replayed it again and again. It wasn't a full-face shot, but it didn't need to be. The timeline, the motive, the history, the physical evidence, the video, it all pointed in one direction. I handed it over to the investigators that evening. They didn't say much, but I could tell it mattered. They took it seriously. One of them looked at me and said, "We'll be in touch soon." Meanwhile, Karen kept showing up like nothing had happened. She hosted an emergency HOA cleanup committee to remove debris from the sidewalk. She told people it was a tragic electrical fire. She even sent a message in the community chat saying, "We all need to stay strong and united in the face of unfortunate events." Unfortunate events? She burned my house down, and now she was pretending to be the hero. But she didn't know I had already spoken to lawyers. I had already collected enough to launch a civil suit. And what she really didn't know was that just days from now, she'd be walking into a courtroom where her reputation wouldn't save her, where her control wouldn't matter, where the truth, cold, clear, and undeniable, would be laid out in front of everyone she once ruled over. I wasn't just rebuilding my house. I was about to burn down her entire story. The summons arrived on a Tuesday morning, neatly tucked into Karen's mailbox by a quiet deputy with zero interest in small talk. She didn't see it coming. That much was clear. I watched from across the street, standing near a neighbor's porch where we were fixing a loose railing. Karen stepped out in her usual morning outfit, joggers, windbreaker, and those same white sneakers with the red heel tab, and pulled the envelope from the box. Her face didn't change at first. But then she opened it. It was almost comical. The confidence drained from her eyes like a leaky faucet. She clutched the paper tighter, scanned it again, and looked up. She didn't see me. Not yet. But I saw her. And for the first time since I'd moved in, she looked unsure. Rattled. Shaken. What she held in her hands was a formal complaint. Civil. Intentional destruction of property. Harassment. Endangerment. She was being sued. And the evidence backing it up was thick, organized, and brutal. I made sure of that. The very next day, I got a call from the county clerk. Karen had filed for a hearing delay. Her attorney needed more time to review the claims. That didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how fast the news spread. Small towns don't run on electricity. They run on whispers. And once word got out that the HOA queen herself was being taken to court by the man whose house burned down, the whispers turned into a buzz. Some people still stayed silent. Others tried to distance themselves. But a few? They started coming forward with things they'd never told anyone. One guy showed me photos of damage Karen had done to his lawn after he voted against her in a board meeting. Another woman said her pool permit was revoked after Karen found out she had let her teenage niece stay over for a week without prior community notification. Pattern. After pattern. After pattern. It wasn't just me. It had never been just me. But I was the first one to drag it all into the light. Karen tried to act normal. She held a small safety committee, meeting in her front yard, and even passed out lemonade like nothing was happening. But the cracks were showing. Her voice had a twitch. Her smile had edges. And she kept looking over her shoulder, like she was waiting for something to fall. And it was. The night before the first hearing, her lawyer called mine and made an offer. Drop the case, and Karen would pay for some of the damages. No admission of guilt, no public statements. Just a quiet transaction, under the rug. Classic HOA move. Keep it silent. Keep it clean. I said no, because this wasn't about money anymore. It was about the principle. It was about the neighbors she'd bullied. The fines she created out of thin air. The fear she injected into people just trying to live their lives. It was about power, and how easily someone like her could abuse it when no one stood up. I wasn't backing down. So the next morning, I walked into the courthouse. Tie straight, shoulders back, calm. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. And who did I see sitting at the defense table, flipping nervously through a stack of papers she didn't understand? Karen. She looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but in presence. Her hair was pulled tighter than usual. Her face pale. And when she finally looked up and saw me walk in, there was no smirk. No smug confidence. Just a blank stare. Because now she was in my world. A world where facts mattered. Where records were kept. Where judges didn't care about HOA titles or perfectly trimmed lawns. They cared about truth. Evidence. Justice. And I had brought all three. Witnesses. Documents. Video footage. Audio recordings. Copies of violation notices with her signature. Testimonies from neighbors she thought would stay silent. Every piece stacked up like bricks, and she had no way to climb over them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The courtroom heard everything they needed from the evidence itself. Karen's attorney tried to spin, stall, shift the blame, but it was weak. Transparent. The judge saw right through it. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just reviewing a dispute. He was watching someone's lies unravel in real time. And Karen knew it. For the first time, she couldn't control the rules. She couldn't hide behind bylaws or proxy votes or community guidelines. She was exposed, vulnerable, and the world she built on fear and intimidation was crumbling right under her. By the second day of the hearing, Karen had lost her composure entirely. Her attorney showed up looking more tired than when this all started, flipping through the same stack of papers that had already failed to defend her. The courtroom wasn't packed, but a few familiar faces from the neighborhood were there. Some just curious, others clearly rooting for her fall. No one sat next to her. She was completely alone at that table, and the silence around her felt heavier than anything I'd ever said in court. I watched her closely as the judge reviewed more of the evidence. I saw the way she avoided eye contact, the way her fingers tapped the desk in quick, nervous bursts. She wasn't used to being questioned. She wasn't used to being powerless. This wasn't the HOA board where she could bulldoze over dissent with fake votes or made-up rules. This was real, and it showed. The turning point came mid-morning. The judge called for the playback of the security footage. It had already been admitted into evidence, but this was the first time it was being shown on screen. The lights dimmed slightly, and everyone's eyes were on the monitor. I could feel Karen squirm before the clip even started. There it was, 11:52 p.m., hooded figure sneaking around the side of my house. The gas can. The pause. The flash. The hurried exit. It was fast, grainy, and mostly shadow, but it was damning. Especially when I zoomed in and paused the frame showing those unmistakable sneakers. The same ones Karen wore that very day. The judge raised an eyebrow. Karen's attorney objected, of course, something about lack of direct identification. But it didn't land. The circumstantial evidence was already overwhelming. This just added visual weight to what everyone already knew. But it wasn't just about the video. It was about everything that led up to that moment. The paper trail. The community complaints. The timeline. The motive. The threats. The fact that Karen had more complaints filed against me in 6 months than the rest of the neighborhood combined over 5 years. The fact that she had once joked on a recorded HOA meeting that some people's homes should just burn down if they can't follow the rules. Her words. On tape. Played aloud in court. Her face turned ghost white as the audio echoed off the courtroom walls. Even her lawyer had to take a beat. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I just looked at her, steady, quiet, and let the weight of her own words crush whatever was left of her defense. Witness after witness came forward. Some of them had never even looked me in the eye before the trial. But now they were stepping up, telling their stories. The fines. The threats. The manipulation. One woman admitted she once cried in her garage after getting a $200 violation for a cracked flower pot. Another said Karen followed her to work to photograph her car parked in a visitor space overnight. These stories added context. They added truth. And they added damage. The judge listened to all of it. No emotion. Just focus. He took notes. He asked sharp questions. He pushed back on weak answers. Karen tried to speak at one point. She asked to address the room directly. Her lawyer hesitated but didn't stop her. Maybe he thought it was all they had left. She stood, cleared her throat, then blamed stress. said she was trying to maintain the beauty and order of the community, claimed that the pressure of responsibility led to overreactions. Not once did she say sorry. Not once did she admit wrongdoing. Her voice trembled not with guilt, but with frustration. She still thought she could talk her way out of it. But it was too late. The moment she sat back down, I knew what came next wouldn't be in her favor. The judge's decision wouldn't come that same day. These things take time. But I could already feel the shift in the room. Karen wasn't feared anymore. Not even by her own lawyer. Not by the neighbors. Not by the board members who had supported her. The illusion of control she had spent years crafting had been shattered in less than 48 hours. Her empire was crumbling, not in private, not quietly, but publicly, and with every word, every photo, every testimony, it was collapsing brick by brick. And she was the one holding the match when it all began. The days following the hearing were oddly quiet. Not just in the courtroom, but in the neighborhood too. The community message board, normally filled with Karen's overly cheerful posts about lawn length and mailbox paint, was silent. The HOA newsletter didn't go out that week. No meetings were called. No reminders were sent. It was like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. People began to act differently. I started getting polite nods from neighbors who used to avoid eye contact. One man stopped me while I was picking up mail, something I hadn't done in weeks, and simply said, "Thank you." About time someone stood up to her. He didn't elaborate, didn't linger. Just said it, meant it, and walked away. I had become something I never set out to be, a symbol. Not a hero, but proof. Proof that you didn't have to roll over. That standing your ground didn't always end in silence. That people like Karen, no matter how deep their claws went into a community, could still be pulled back out. Meanwhile, Karen had vanished. Her car was still parked in the same spot every morning, but no one saw her walking her dog or watering her plants or measuring someone's hedges with a ruler like she used to. Her usual morning jogs stopped. Her porch lights stayed off at night. The woman who once ran every corner of the neighborhood like it was her kingdom had become a ghost inside her own home. But legally, things were just getting started. Though the hearing was over, the case had moved forward quickly. The fire marshal's report had been finalized. It confirmed what we all suspected. Gasoline was poured at 2 ignition points and traces of Karen's fingerprints were found on a half-burned lighter recovered from the bushes along the back fence. It had been missed during the initial sweep, but rain earlier that week had washed ash away and left it exposed. That, combined with the video, the audio, the testimonies, and her pattern of behavior, it was more than enough. Criminal charges were filed. Arson, attempted insurance fraud, harassment, destruction of property. And because my neighbor's kid had been playing with their dog 2 houses down when the fire started, they also added reckless endangerment of a minor. Karen had gone from HOA president to criminal defendant in a matter of weeks. But even that wasn't the end of it. With the civil case still ongoing, and now the criminal case looming, more residents finally found their voices. A petition began circulating, calling for the immediate dissolution of the current HOA board. Not just Karen, but every one of her allies who had turned a blind eye to her actions. Within 3 days, it had over 100 signatures. More than half the neighborhood. By the end of the week, the HOA was officially suspended pending legal restructuring. The board members stepped down quietly, one by one. Karen's name was removed from the official HOA website. The same photo of her smiling in front of a fountain with a blazer and clipboard was gone. I didn't celebrate. Not yet, because while justice was being served, I still didn't have a home. The burned remains had been cleared, the site now leveled, but I hadn't begun rebuilding. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure I wanted to do it there. That plot of land, for all its memories, still smelled of smoke when the wind blew just right. It still carried the weight of nights I couldn't sleep, wondering how far someone would go to silence me. But as I stood there one morning, sipping coffee from a paper cup, I noticed something I hadn't before. 3 new houses down the road had fresh paint on their fences. A neighbor was planting flowers near the sidewalk, sunflowers, the very kind Karen had once banned. A welcome mat appeared in front of the rental house across the street, and kids were playing soccer on the lawn without fear of being told to stop. Something was shifting. This place was starting to breathe again. Without the iron grip of one person's fear and ego, people were remembering what it felt like to actually live here. To be part of a neighborhood, not a regime. To enjoy their homes without constantly looking over their shoulders. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth rebuilding for. A few weeks later, I got a call from the district attorney's office. The trial date was confirmed. Karen would be standing in front of a criminal court, facing not just me, but the entire weight of everything she had done. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, professional, but there was something in their tone that told me this case wasn't just another file on a desk. It meant something. And it wasn't just about justice for me. It was about setting a precedent for every person who had been silenced by someone like her. That afternoon, I drove through the neighborhood. Slowly. Not out of sadness, not even to check on the lot where my house once stood. I just wanted to see the place through a different lens. Without the shadow of Karen hovering over every driveway. Without the fear of another anonymous violation slipping into someone's mailbox. And for the first time in months, it felt normal. There were kids riding scooters, unsupervised and laughing. Someone had hung wind chimes from their porch, something Karen had once ruled as a noise disturbance. A small group of teens was playing guitar near the lakefront. Even the park bulletin board, once plastered with HOA warnings, now had flyers for a community cookout and a dog rescue fundraiser. People were living again. And while I hadn't fully decided if I'd rebuild yet, seeing the shift reminded me that maybe this place wasn't broken. It was just suppressed. Karen hadn't created order. She had manufactured fear. Now that she was gone, the soul of the community was waking up. Meanwhile, Karen's world was collapsing. Her home, once the model residence on the HOA website, had become a kind of local symbol of irony. The same neighbors she fined for flower colors or parking violations now walked past her house with ease. Some even waved. Not in kindness, but in finality. A reminder that her control had evaporated. Word spread that her husband had filed for separation. Apparently, he hadn't even known the full extent of what she'd done. He had suspected the fines, the drama, but arson? Insurance fraud? Court cases with kids involved? That was too far. He moved out. Took the dog. Karen hadn't been seen in over a week. Her attorney, once sharp and confident, now stumbled through paperwork and late filings. I heard he'd quietly asked the judge for a plea deal, an effort to avoid the embarrassment of a full public trial. The judge hadn't ruled yet, but part of me hoped it would go forward anyway, because people needed to see it. They needed to witness what happens when someone abuses power for too long. I kept building my own case quietly. The civil suit still had legs, and I wasn't backing off. Not for money, not for vengeance, but because people like Karen don't just need to lose. They need to be held accountable in every way that matters. Financially, legally, publicly. My insurance had finally come through, by the way. The house would be covered in full. Rebuilding was back on the table, but I was doing it on my terms. No HOA approval. No design committee. Just me, a blank plot of land, and full creative control. And it felt right. Not as a fresh start, but as a return to something that had been taken. I'd hired a local builder. Good guy. Known in town for being honest, efficient, and respectful of boundaries. Everything Karen wasn't. We sat on the lot one morning going over ideas. He asked me if I wanted the new place to look like the old one. I paused. No, I said. I want it to feel like freedom. He smiled and nodded. As the plans came together, so did the town around me. Neighbors who once barely nodded were now offering help. One guy offered to plant new grass at no cost. Another dropped off coffee and homemade muffins. A woman I barely knew brought over a binder full of receipts and letters she had kept for years. Proof of Karen's behavior. Just in case I needed more evidence. It was more than generosity. It was a quiet form of apology. Not for what they did, but for what they didn't do. For staying silent. For letting Karen grow unchecked. For letting her make them believe that standing up would cost more than staying quiet. But now they knew better. And every time a shovel hit the ground, every time a neighbor offered help, every time a kid laughed on the street Karen once tried to control, it all felt like justice inching closer. Not loud. Not violent. Just steady. A few days before the court date, something strange happened. I got a letter in the mail. Not an email. Not a message. A proper, hand-delivered envelope with no return address. For a second, my heart sank. I thought maybe Karen was back to her tricks. Another fake complaint? A forged document? But when I opened it, the contents were something I never expected. It was an apology. 3 short sentences. Asterisk, I didn't know she'd go that far. I'm sorry I stayed quiet. I hope you win. Asterisk. No name. Just those words typed out and signed. I sat there staring at it for a long time. I didn't know who sent it. Could have been one of the other HOA board members. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe even someone from Karen's own family. But the words didn't matter as much as the shift they represented. This was a community that had been afraid for too long, controlled by her presence. And now, that silence was breaking. That note didn't change my plans, but it reminded me that I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The morning of the trial arrived like any other. Except it wasn't. My phone buzzed constantly, texts from neighbors wishing me luck, a couple of people even offering to come sit in the courtroom gallery. I told them it wasn't necessary, but honestly, it meant something, even just knowing they cared. When I stepped into that courtroom, it wasn't fear I felt. It wasn't even anger. It was clarity. Karen was already seated with her attorney. Her hair pulled back tight, face expressionless, but I could tell. This wasn't the Karen who used to strut around the neighborhood barking orders. She looked smaller now, like the weight of everything had finally started sinking in. And this wasn't even the verdict day. This was just the beginning. The judge came in. Everyone rose. The usual formalities kicked off. And then, just as the charges were being read out loud, arson, insurance fraud, harassment, destruction of private property, Karen looked up. Our eyes met. For the first time, I saw something real flicker in her expression. It wasn't guilt. Not exactly. But it wasn't pride either. It was recognition. Like she finally realized she wasn't untouchable. The prosecution laid out their evidence with calm precision. Security footage. Cell tower data. Witness statements. Even the petty stuff Karen thought she got away with, like past threats and violations, were now building blocks in a much larger structure. Every petty fine, every manipulated vote, every quiet intimidation tactic. They were all painting a pattern. A pattern of control. Of obsession. Of cruelty with a smile. And every time they mentioned the fire, asterisk my home asterisk, I had to steady my breath. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't want her to see me blink. But I didn't want to become her either. This wasn't revenge. This was accountability. A line between right and wrong. And this time, I was standing on the right side of it, backed by truth, not fear. During a short recess, I stepped out into the hallway. That's when someone approached me. Middle-aged man. Professional suit. He introduced himself as a former HOA president from a neighborhood 2 towns over. Said he'd been following the case through local media. Apparently, Karen's antics had become a cautionary tale, and this trial was being watched by a lot more people than I realized. He shook my hand and said, "You're doing this for more than just yourself." I nodded. I felt that. Back inside, Karen's lawyer tried to chip away at the timeline. Tried to suggest there was no direct link between her and the fire. But every attempt looked weaker than the last. The jury didn't flinch. The judge raised his eyebrows more than once. It was clear. This wasn't going to end well for her. By the end of the day, she looked drained. Not angry. Not even defensive. Just exhausted. Like she had finally run out of ways to justify it all. Even to herself. After court was dismissed for the day, I walked back to my car. The courthouse steps felt long and heavy. But it wasn't dread that filled me. It was something else. Maybe peace. Maybe progress. Maybe both. A few neighbors were waiting at the bottom. One handed me a coffee. Another gave me a simple thumbs up. I didn't need a parade. I didn't want a trophy. All I wanted was to keep walking. Keep moving forward. Keep building a life where no one like Karen ever had that kind of power again. And from the way things were shaping up, that's exactly what was happening.